Hi there, my name is Teni Brant, and welcome to Speak Dicely, the podcast where I get together with other tabletop enthusiasts and we speak Dicely together. In order for a game to happen, a game master will need to pick a setting to place the story in. Some GMs, however, will choose the pursuit of creating their own original setting. But in doing so, you run the risk of investing in topics that aren't crucial to your game, and time management is crucial for most every GM's sanity. Joining me today to talk about world building are Logan LCKraken and SellotapeBeanie and ThatDutchGeek, one of the players and the DM, respectively, of the live stream D&D game Dungeon Select. Hey there, folks.
How's it going?
Hello.
Good, how's everybody today?
I mean, we're all excited for this, I think. I think we've all been excited for this.
Yeah, I was looking forward to this. This is fun.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I could tell yesterday we had Beanie was like 7 hours to go. We're like, we're a day early, man.
my work schedule at the moment is hectic, so I was like, gotta get stuff done, gotta get everything done. I've got shit to do this evening. Oh, it's Monday.
It's nice. All good. I was like, oh, that's awesome. I feel like most of my introductions recently have been, let's talk about the embarrassing shit that the guests have done right before the podcast.
Best way to be.
What way to break the ice, dude? That's mine and Beanie's friendship is taking a piss out of each other, so it's fine. Feel right at home.
I know we had we've had all the other Dungeon Select people on the podcast at this point, like Laura Kay, Belle Mist in one episode, and then I didn't realize Koiba, Soko, and Sir Duke, I guess, are labeled as the rambly bunch of the crew. So we had 5 people on that episode, and now I've been told the pair of you like to just get at each other.
There's care there, but it's just because we're friends and we know each other very well. We also know what pushes each other's buttons, and we just don't shy away from pushing those buttons sometimes. You know, it's just
we've been friends for a reasonable while now, and I think at this point we're both comfortable enough around each other that we can be those horrible people to each other and still know that there's that underlying level of decency. You know, if I come home and I'm like, I really want to rant and play some video games, I'd be like, hey, Dutch.
Well, that's nice.
I'd be like, no, go fuck yourself.
oh my. Well, and there you go. Like the fact that you guys have that trust between each other and know that it's not like vicious. That's crucial. Well, for healthy relationships, but also for D&D.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure if it was vicious, I'd have died many times by I sort of have died many times by now in our campaign, but
twice.
You know,
once.
I think. If you're including... Oh, this is going to get deep into DS lore. If you're including the whole rebirth, then technically I've died 3 times.
There you go.
I'm on my 4th life on the same character, and... Oh boy.
Dang.
Man, and I thought I killed my PCs a lot.
I have a file in which I actually keep track of deaths. Yeah.
To be fair to him, one of those was a character choice.
Seto Koiba is in the lead with 4 deaths.
We're joined. No, we're not, because he got disintegrated.
Yeah, he did.
He got disintegrated. Our bard had a wish spell. He's now back and alive, and the time police are after us for messing with the timeline.
They are.
Oh. Wait, this is like Forgotten Realms lore. Are you using the Eternals in your game by any chance? Is that what they're called?
Yes.
The Inevitables. Yeah. Wow. Ooh.
It's like a 3.5 only thing, and I didn't even know they were a thing until someone DM'd me and was like, yo. And then I looked at it, and the first thing I read was about one particular one that is in charge of protecting the integrity of time and space and whatever, and that they have a focus on making sure that wish spells aren't being used to fuck shit up. And I was like, oh, that happened pretty recently. Huh, that's cool. Good to know. So yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I have not seen one of those used in a game, so that is very exciting. I need to catch up.
Yeah. There's a lot. There's a lot.
So the whole crew of us together here, I mean, all 3 of you are streamers, so you've got that in common, but all 4 of us, we all here are DMs, and I believe we all here are the world builders, correct?
Yeah.
I can get through this.
I'm a world birder.
We are the world birders. And welcome to our first ever gig.
I like to go to McDonald's and order a world birder. Oh,
Nice.
with extra fries. Anyway, we build worlds.
We try.
Yeah.
That's kind of what today's theme is going to be on. But to get at the core of SellotapeBeanie here and ThatDutchGeek, the question that I pose to our first time guests on this channel is, well, this one's not a question, but tell us about yourself. And then a question, what is it you're passionate about and how did you get into tabletop RPGs?
You want to take it first, Dutch?
Oh, okay. No, you can go first. You can go first.
Okay, I'll go first, I guess. My name's Ethan, or SellotapeBeanie. Everyone just tends to call me Ethan or Beanie. I am passionate about things like obviously tabletop gaming. I also play a lot of FPS games, retro games. I have a real sort of interest in graphic design. I've made some very cool clothing things and things like that. God, describing yourself off the cuff, is wild. I think in terms of D&D specifically, I'm very much, as a player, I like to be the very sort of sensible, level-headed combatant. Sort of, I want to be the one that's like, okay, well, if I move here and do this, I like to be very tactical about it. And then as a DM, I'm the exact opposite. I'm a chaotic mess.
I'm ThatDutchGeek, but you can call me Dutch. I am Dutch, as in I'm from the Netherlands, born and raised, still live there. I am a very passionate gamer. I play a variety of different types of games, from FPS to open world RPGs to MMOs, you name it, I play it. Not very picky on my genres per se, as long as it has a good story and good gameplay elements to keep me engaged, I'm in, pretty much. Very passionate about D&D, which is kind of a world I kind of stumbled into 2.5 years ago. I started watching Critical Role, and I was like, yo, I can try. I want to try this. And here we are 2.5 years later, running a campaign that's about to end, and doing okay, if I have to believe my players. So, yeah, that's it pretty much.
So the Dungeon Select game was your first DM'd game?
Well, yes and no. I did a couple of... I started a little campaign off-stream to kind of get my bearings, and that kind of ran for a few weeks. Then I started Dungeon Select, and I did both simultaneously, and eventually it got to a point where I was like, okay, I can't DM 2 campaigns, it's too much. So I cut the off-stream one off, and I decided to just focus myself on Dungeon Select. So I DM'd a few sessions before I started Dungeon Select, but basically, yeah.
Well, I mean, you guys are like 2.5 years in, so yeah, I mean, it's been enough to keep your attention, it's been enough to keep your players' attention, and avoiding that burnout is like, that's a big step in itself, so kudos to you guys. But let's start talking about some world building stuff. Like, so can you tell us about a setting, a world that you've created, or if you haven't made one, a concept that you've had in mind?
Logan, you want to do this one first, since we were super fucking loud on the intro?
Yeah, sounds good. So I've definitely created quite a few worlds, from just taking things like Eberron and pre-existing things and twisting them to my current campaign that I'm running is set in a world called Averia. And it actually started as a concept that Denny played the only session of it ever, which was a bunch of sky pirate things. And that never, it was a really fun one session. I had made these 3 kingdoms in the world. We never went back to it. Eventually I had to, I guess I didn't have to, I chose to DM for my group of friends. And we were like, oh, let's do something where people can drop in, drop out. And I created this, I took that sky pirate idea and I was like, well, let's just do a pirate themed campaign. And I was like, I want it to be about exploration. So I left most of the world actually in that one uncharted. That actually just started to evolve into its own thing. But yeah.
Do you want to talk about DS World, Dutch, or do you want me to talk first?
I mean, yeah, I can talk about DS World. Dungeon Select takes place in a world called Keldalar, which is the first world I created. Started off as just one continent and is now, over the past 2.5 years, it's grown into 5 continents that all have different stuff going on. But it started off as one continent because that was where the campaign was going to take place. So I was like, okay, that's where all my focus is going. And I don't know, over time, as I got more experienced, I was like, this doesn't feel enough like a world, if that makes sense, you know? So I decided, okay, let's throw some other stuff in there. And I started making a map, and I was like, okay, let's just make a map and see what we'll do, and we'll worry about the places on the map later. And it kind of spiraled out of control a little bit. There's a lot of places that nobody's ever been to nor heard of or whatever, but it's there just in case, you know, it's a buffer for later, I guess. It started off very small, and it's very classic, like high fantasy stuff going on. Different political systems depending on what continent you're on, because I did want to experiment with that a little bit. So there's an empire, there's a kingdom, there's a bunch of different stuff going on. And that's where we are now. And now, because campaign 1 is ending and I'm starting to prepare for campaign 2, I'm working on yet another new place in that same world, which is still very early in development, but it's being worked on. And I don't even know what's going to happen there yet, political-wise and everything else. So
about 2 years ago, I started running one-shots where I would teach some of my friends that enjoyed the concept of D&D but didn't necessarily know how to play or hadn't played before. And I decided, for the sake of my sanity, if I didn't want to run anything that was pre-written, I wanted to build some sort of world where I had that depth of knowledge to be able to run whatever I want within it, but also that customization where someone can bring a character concept to me and I can say, yeah, sure, we'll fit that in, we'll make it work. And that ended up creating this very sort of sprawling world concept that I called The Rim. I've done a few streamed episodes in this. I haven't delved into it too much. The general concept was, I'm going to make things easy for myself. I'm going to take some of the Dawn War Pantheon gods, at least for starting continents, and then I started to get really complicated with it, because that's who I am as a person, to the point where different continents will have different views of the gods, and some of those gods transfer across and are the same entities under different names. Some of those are different entities that, for whatever reason, only show themselves or interact with specific continents. And that created this really sort of, what I feel is a very sort of rich world building, where you have this sense of not being uniform and everything being different across different continents, different cultures, different food, different locations, different building techniques. All of those weirdly different things started because I wanted to give myself enough variety to run one-shots and teach people how to play.
Nice. And I myself, the setting I've currently run in is a campaign setting called Medozan. Oh dear, I'm messing up the pronunciation of my own world. Medozan. And my setting has kind of gone through rewrites, because it was the setting that my last campaign was run in, but the entire campaign was basically just underground. So the surface was completely irrelevant. And I think when I started that campaign, it had a different world name, and I was like, no, I don't like that world name. So now it's landed on what it is. And as that campaign went on, like, things became more solidified as players kept making choices. And I was like, okay, I thought this, but I like that better now that they've interacted with the world in that way. So this is now a world fact. And now that a lot of these answers are put in place, the second campaign that we're about to run with this channel is in the same setting, but now on the surface world. And a lot of those facts are now cemented, and I can kind of work with these limitations that my previous players had done. And so I love doing map work. So I've got a world map already for this setting. A lot of it isn't going to be used at all for this next campaign, but I like having it there just in case. And I don't even have answers for, like, is this particular continent explored? Well, I've given it a name. What does that mean? And I might be able to figure that out later. There's a lot of this kind of putting things in place and then figuring out why afterwards, I think, is a bit of my process.
I feel like that's something that a lot of newer, not necessarily newer DMs, but newer world builders definitely trip up on. This concept of, because the modules have everything covered and everything written, you need to have everything covered and everything written. And I think that I really enjoy some of that level of collaborative world building. Your players decide a thing or they do a thing, and you're like, okay, well, I hadn't considered that, but that's the way it works now. Or that's the way that place is now. I feel like that's some of the benefit of building your own world is that you can make those changes. You don't have to tell your players necessarily, but you can decide, I don't like that name for this place, so I'm either going to change it, or I'm going to decide that actually this place has 2 names depending on who you speak to. And that sort of ability to change things and give yourself that leeway, I think, is something that where you've written less, you've written more in a sense.
Yeah, and like with that talk of like player influence, I also just love doing things where it's like if a player is like, oh, I was, expert blacksmith from my hometown, it's like, cool, what is the blacksmithing process like? What is, the traditional tools and stuff that your town had that we've started in? Because you're the expert on it. I've had in a non-D&D game, someone was they had created a militarized, like essentially K-pop idol organization that they were from. It was like, we never actually fully started running, but it was like, cool. What do they do? What is their influence in the world? You were the player who created this. You're the expert on it. Like if they tried to make something really that like derailed everything, sure, we'll rein it in. But I love giving my players a chance to be a part of that world building.
I definitely have had players kind of change my view of certain areas in the world as well. Whereas if someone comes at me with a backstory for a character that they're bringing in, and they're like, well, this is what I wrote, and then I read through it and I see them talk about an area that they lived in, and there's been places that have just been completely replaced with whatever area they described in their backstory, because I just felt that made more sense to be in that side of the world where I had previously already put something else, but this works better. So there's definitely, especially when it comes to player backstories, I've definitely scratched some stuff off and put their version of that place in there, because it just worked better and makes it easier for me as well, because they've already have an image of said place in their head. So that way, if we ever get to it, I can start describing it, and they'll immediately clock like, oh, this is me, which I really like.
Yeah, and I mean, as you're building the world too, like the process I've been going through with my players is this is your part of the world, so I'll collaborate with you on it, and like I want you to tell me what this part of the world is. If something doesn't make sense, I'll let you know, like that kind of breaks something to do with the world, but we'll do our best to make it fit in the vision that you have. But yeah, no, the players are a crucial part of world building, because it is the setting that they're going to be playing in. So they might as well have a say in it, and it makes our job easier because more brains make for easier work.
Absolutely.
I'm a lazy GM.
Sure does. It sure does. Love it when people come at me with pages worth of stuff about their hometown. I was like, great, thank you. And I just slap it in there. Don't edit a thing. Like, perfect.
Erase their name, put mine. This is the world I created.
You made this? I made this.
I made this.
I do definitely think that it's great doing that, especially because a lot of players that have never DM'd before don't realize like how solid their world building ideas can be. And the fact that they can come up with a concept and you're like, I never would have thought of that because I'm used to building worlds this specific way, or as a DM, I've fallen into building worlds in the style of what I watch or what the other modules I've ran. And then someone comes at you with an idea that's just so far out, you're like, no, I love it.
So, yeah, I mean, yeah, the players are so crucial in the world building, but let's hypothetically remove the players from the equation. If you're not exactly collaborating with the players as an experiment, what does your process for world building look like? Like, where do you start, and what are the kind of steps you go through?
For me personally, when I'm building a world, the way I like to start is I will begin with a map. I feel like a map's crucial. I feel like a map not only gives you an idea of distance and layout and design, but also a map. If you're running a world where you want things to feel realistic and you want there to be that sense of, I guess, lived in or alive worlds. For me, that starts with a map. Because I'll design a map and I'll put some generic landscape features like rivers and lakes and mountains. And I'll say, okay, if there are mountains here, there's probably ore in those mountains. Or there's some sort of rock or coal. There's something in those mountains to make them worth having on your map. So there's probably a settlement here, and that settlement is probably going to specialize or be built around whatever's valuable in those mountains. If this landscape is harsh and sunny and hot and dry, those small pockets of lakes or rivers or the coast are going to be where people settle. And it's something that stems from human history. It's people will settle where the resources are. So if you start with a map, you know where your resources are. You build those cities. You say, okay, the first cities would at least be here. And then you can start maybe moving a day or two's travel away. If you're especially somewhere where the terrain is difficult, settlements are more likely to be, at least for me, more likely to be smaller and less spread out. Because people are less likely to want to travel for extended periods of time through hazardous terrain. Once I've got the sort of general layout of my maps going, I'll pick a starting point based on the story that I want to tell. And I feel like as long as you have a vague idea of the other sort of areas on your world map, you don't need to flesh them out yet necessarily. The best place to start for me is where you want to start your story from. Because it's brilliant if you know that your capital city on the other side of the world has 7 different types of bakery. But if you don't know what's in the town you're starting in, how can you relay that to your players? How can you make it feel like it's not just you're in a tavern in a town? So I like to build that depth from wherever my starting point is outwards. I like to design things based on the logical, to what feels logical to me in terms of resources and stuff. And then I'll start expanding on that with more of a, I guess what I describe as the human aspect, but the human aspect being all, whichever races live in your world. You know, I'll start discussing, okay, if people settled here and here, are they on good terms? Are they not on good terms? Is there conflict there? If they have borders or their resources between the two sort of settlements, is that likely to create conflict? If you have a particular state or province or county that you've picked and that has a bunch of what you would consider valuable resources, that settlement or that area is likely to be quite prosperous, which would mean there's the possibility, not necessarily, but the possibility they would have a strong military because they can fund them, they can feed them. And that's when you start to think, okay, maybe they would have expanded this border. Maybe that's now the main province of this world or this continent. And that's how I like to, I guess, spiderweb out from my initial concept. I like to think about the stories I want to tell. If your players want a political intrigue story, for example, you're going to want to add more of those political conflicts, both within the area, but also with neighbors, neighboring cities, neighboring continents, neighboring provinces. And you want to put something to give reason for that. You want to have there to be some in-world reason other than we don't like them. Do they have religious difficulties or differences? Do they have cultural differences that make those two communities clash? Is there something of value that one community has and the other community desires? And that's how you build that conflict.
Damn, that was really good.
I like my world building. It's to me, it's something that cements your, both as a DM but also for your players, it cements that feeling of impacting the world and being a part of the world. It doesn't just feel like you're moving through, this is town A, this is town B. I want each town to have at least one thing that stands out that makes them different. So this is the town we went to that had the really big port. This is the town we went to that had some sketchy soldiers and a gallows. This is the town we went to that had an insanely big church, but we weren't actually sure which god it was for. If you can give your players something, not necessarily something big, but something unique about each settlement, each province, each capital city, that helps them differentiate. Were we at this tavern in City A, or were we at this tavern in... No, we were in City B, and I remember because we went past the really big church. And I feel like that makes the whole experience both more fun, but also easier to keep track of as a player and a DM.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, being able to make your locations within your world be unique is very important, because otherwise you've got a world and you've got locations, but if they're not unique locations, then it's just, you might as well just stay in one town then. So Logan or Dutch, do either of you have a process that varies at all from how Ethan does it?
Yeah, I definitely don't start with a map. Maps are actually, for me, I think one of the later in the process things. But I start with the first thing is, what is the type of world I want to DM in? Like, what is, looking at like a literary form or something, if I'm telling, like, I want to really tell a story that's like got gothic horror themes, maybe we're getting to some weird like Lovecraftian Bloodborne type stuff in the story. It's like, okay, that's going to influence everything about this world. So I try to think of that because, if those themes and ideas aren't something that I'm interested in creating a world for, then I'm not going to find that motivation. Like, and that might also mean that, for a period of time, I'm not the DM for my group. If they're all really wanting to play high fantasy, but the only thing I can think of wanting to create for is, gothic horror, it's like, okay, someone else take the reins and we'll, do this another time. But then once I think of that, I really start, I do a lot of like big to small. It's kind of like two schools of thought with world building, which is you go big to small, or you go small to big. And I think I start big, then I jump to small. I do it really weird. I start big, jump to small, and then work back up. But the first thing I ask is, are there gods in this world? Because that influences so much stuff. Because one, if there aren't, what are clerics and paladins, if anything? Are they people who just have innate magic powers and have been tricking the rest of everyone else? Are they maybe going to become the gods? Who knows? And then I like to figure out what is magic in this world, because those are like, and I guess in a sense both are very tied together, and those are like such huge elements of, and this is really focusing on D&D, that they will shape so many things. If your world is high magic, why are people worrying about, like, is there like starvation? If people can make food with magic, like, is everyone taken care of? Then what are the issues? And so once I figure those out, I won't figure out necessarily the entirety of the world. I won't be like, oh, there's like 5 continents, because that's where I think the big building just doesn't make sense for me. But I'll figure out kind of in the middle, like, what is, how many countries or kingdoms or empires have a stake in this land that the player's journey is starting on. And I'll be like, cool, I really want a conflict between, I like 3 often, 3 nations. Usually it's like 2 are against each other, and 1 can be swayed. And that gives, like, with a political intrigue thing, the players can pick a side, and then try and work for an ally. And then I'm like, cool, there are these 3 countries. What makes them uniquely different is where I break that down. And I'll usually be like, what is a resource one has? What is like the thing that one, like each one wants from the other ones? And just like what culturally makes them different. So in Averia, when we started it was in this land called Palmacosta. So the 3 kingdoms, there was a predominantly human and dwarf kingdom that was very militaristic. They had a lot of physical resources. What they wanted from everyone was like the farmable lands that they had. There was the Quarantal Emporium, which was essentially a bunch of merchants that had taken a small plot of land, had a lot of money, and were like, we're just going to deal in trade. And they had a lot of like rare, like jewels and spices and stuff. And then there was an area that was predominantly elves. They had a lot of farmable land and magic. And they actually wanted, which didn't come up too much. They wanted everyone else. The kingdom was at one point all theirs, and their true want was to unify the kingdom under them again. And then I'll work down like, okay, you know what? We've got these 3 things. Let's find that starting town, because the players will, probably from level 1 to 3. And honestly, I think a starting town can definitely push past that. Be in roughly one location, so it's finding that out, fleshing it out, and then I'll start being like, okay, let's work from there. Let's find, if they're starting in a town, what's the closest big city? How populous is this area? I started using, there's a document, I don't know how I found it, but it talks about how population density in like medieval to like Renaissance times kind of worked. And it was like, oh, if your population is this many people, you probably only have one big city. You have 5 towns. You have a bunch of little villages and hamlets and stuff. They're not important enough to be on maps, but they're probably small farming communities that just kind of take care of themselves, send stuff to the bigger towns and cities, get things from them, bring them back. And then, from there, once I have those ideas, I'll start drawing the map and figure out what I want. So the most recent one was I wanted a very frigid area in the north, a mountain range that divided them, and then kind of getting into more habitable areas down south. And then I start being like, okay, similar to what Beanie said, like being like, okay, resources would be here. Here's a river. That means fresh water. There's a lake. Like, let's, these are probably where people would settle. And then based on that first question of what type of story I wanted to tell in this world with my players, figure out where that first town's going to be.
How about you, Dutch?
I also start with a map. That's the first thing I do is, okay, before I can start thinking of stuff, I need to visualize, like, okay, how is this going to look? That's how my brain works. And I work pretty systematically from that point. I start with a map that I don't put any towns on yet, but I do make sure that I have like the geography right, so mountains, rivers, lakes, what kind of climates in what areas. Then I move on to spreading around towns, cities, points of interest, whether it be mines or a known hunting ground or whatever it may be, just points of interest to kind of filling map out. Then I go to religion. That's when I start thinking of, okay, what is religion here? Gods, or do they believe in lesser beings that pose as gods, or are they, what kind of religion, how prevalent is religion, and what gods, if any, are worshipped, which ones are frowned upon, that whole system I flesh out. That's when I jump to politics. That's when I jump to, politics as in, with that in mind and knowing where some of the cities are, how are they ruled? How vastly is the variation? Is it just all one thing, or is there political differences from town to town? And I systematically, like, I have like a checklist in my head where I'm just like, okay, check. Now I can do politics. Okay, now I can do. And as far as once I determine where the party is going to start, I kind of have this radius in my head that's like, okay, they're in this town, therefore I should know what goes on in, say, these 4 towns that are close by, because there's a chance that, gossip, and they can hear NPCs talk to each other about, oh, have you heard about this family in that town, and something weird's going on. For me, that makes the world feel alive, as a point where there's stuff going on outside of the town where the players are in that I need to know of, or else it's not happening. So I have like a radius, and if I know, like, okay, my players made plans to go to this town next, I make sure that, again, that town, I have a radius around, like, okay, I know what goes on in this radius. And that's kind of how I fill in the towns. Most of the towns remain empty until I know my party is going to go somewhat near them, and that's when I start, okay, now I need to actually know for myself what's going on in there, and who live there, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and for myself, it's funny because we seem to have like a 2-in-2 kind of system going on here between us 4 DMs, because I also start on it's similar to Logan, but I don't think I'm quite the same. I start with kind of a single sentence concept of a story. So like for the last campaign I ran, we had for the last 250 years, dragons have ruled the surface and civilizations have fled underground. And there are certain implications based on that statement. So it's like, yeah, okay, so this is an underground campaign. There's a lot of dragons on the surface. And then I might start expanding on that phrase. The gods and devils have not been able to be contacted shortly before the dragons took over, and the elves also vanished just before the dragons took over. And so I begin kind of asking myself questions about this setting based on this phrase, this idea I've come up with. And I'll try to track down, like, based on this implication, well, what's the technology level going to be? What's the magic level going to be? What's the mood or genre? Like, since it's underground, it's likely going to be a bit dreary. You know, the last bastions of civilization is probably going to be something a bit hopeless, maybe at first. Maybe it develops into a very heroic story later on. And again, like you guys were mentioning too, the relationship between the deities and religion, in which case I already answered that in my phrase. They haven't been able to be contacted. But then I was able to kind of further that and be like, okay, if they can't be contacted, what then? One of the characters like started worshiping this gem and everyone's like, that seems cool. We'll do that too. And it's usually around this point that I'll start doing some map building, especially of not always the world. It, like in this underground setting, it wasn't relevant to make a world map. So it was kind of like a few caverns, and like I actually left space between them because it was like the caverns have, or the paths between these caverns haven't been able to be mapped. So it could actually take you days if you're not skilled at traversing through these underground pathways. But I will definitely begin fleshing out the starting location. So whatever the town is, what's the culture? What are the peoples? What are some factions there? I'll try and give 3 distinct things about that place. What's the biome, the geography, the politics, and the economy? And you guys already mentioned like a lot of how you determine this kind of stuff, so I'm not going to dwell on that too long. And then I'll just put in the important story elements like critical NPCs and quests, objectives, things to do within that specific location, and then we'll see what happens. And I won't worry too much about places that aren't the starting location. Maybe I'll have like a one sentence like, I'll place towns nearby, but I won't go further than that. I'll be like, this one is the town that is known for being scummy. It's filled with crime. And this town's the one that is known for finding gems a lot. So I guess they're a gem mining community. Like just a quick bullet point. Or that's the one where that's all Dragonborn.
I feel like there's something we've all touched on without realizing we've all touched on in terms of world building, which is those core assumptions. Those initial decisions you make about your world building that affect everything else, that you can start with your players and you'll be like, okay, this is a world where the gods exist, the gods don't exist, where there's conflict or there's peace. Those initial core assumptions are the best place, I guess, to sort of start getting an idea in your head of what you want your world to be. You know, how old's the world? Is it fully explored? Is magic a thing? If magic exists, is it high magic? Is it low magic? Is magic abundant? Is magic something that's, you know, held behind some sort of gate or in some way made inaccessible to the common people? And from there you can start and build off that. Because, of course, in a world where there's no magic, you're not going to have floating cities. And as Logan brought up, if you're in a world where you can make food with magic, are people starving? If they are starving, why? Why are they starving? Is there some sort of disparity or divide between the upper and lower classes? There's some sort of disparity or divide based on whether or not you have magical abilities. But all those core assumptions can always be a very good place to build off in terms of the content of your world. And I feel like we've all mentioned those without necessarily mentioning that, you know, we have those core assumptions. I think even in fantasy literature or any literature really, you can look at a book and be like, there are core assumptions here. If the book doesn't state otherwise, your core assumption will be that this is a modern setting. If there are those, if it is a fantasy setting, there'll always be sort of the first like couple of pages or chapter describing the world, describing whether or not there are gods. They're sort of, these core assumptions are a very basic framework to start building off.
And that might be dependent on what system you're playing in too, because like you mentioned magic as one of the core assumptions, and that might be because we're playing in Dungeons and Dragons specifically, which is reliant on magic as a system within the worlds that you create playing D&D. Whereas something a bit more mundane, maybe you don't have to ask that question, or maybe if you say there is magic, then the implication is that's strange, and what can you do with it? But definitely just kind of figuring out these core assumptions and asking questions is a big part of world building. And like, well, if this exists, what does that mean? If that means that, what does that mean? You can get into a huge hole in fleshing out your worlds. And I'm sure we do.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's part of the passion, though. Like, I feel like, for me personally, and I think I know a lot of other people like this, you start off with a world that you build for a game. And after that point, you're like, I know they're never going to go here, but this is my passion project now. This is my safe, my comfortable thing to do. I'm bored. I'm going to write some more. I'm going to write about this one small gnome in a city 3,000 miles away from the main party that has an antique shop. But if you ask very nicely, he has a secret stash of cookies.
I mean, yeah, it's wild how easily you can like fall in that rabbit hole of just like, oh yeah, I'll just do this and then I'll do that, and then suddenly you're just world building for hours on end, and then you realize, wait, what just happened? And it's just this entire new place that no one will ever visit nor go to, but it's there, it exists just in case.
And then at some point the players will decide, fuck whatever you're doing, we're getting on an airship and we're going somewhere else, and you're like, great, actually you're prepared for this.
My one friend who's been on the podcast, Adrian, when he ran a campaign for us, he had this like map that he placed in front of us that just had all these places on it, but there were two in particular that the campaign for the longest time never took us to. One called Some Bears and one called Some Sharks. And we were like, he finally did like a session where we split up, and it was essentially like the Dragon Ball, like hyperbolic time chamber. You're just going to like train in essentially a virtual reality world of your world. And so we my group was like, well, we're finding out what the fuck Some Bears is. And he had made this whole little bear community. And they were just like this backwater town that like, you know, they didn't have a lot of stuff. They weren't very smart. And our players convinced them that we were gods.
That's amazing.
Because we came in, to be fair, this is also a campaign that had robots and stuff. So like 2 of the 3 of us that went there were robots. We were super overpowered, so it was not unconvincing that we were gods. But this was like the one place in the world that was just some anthropomorphic bears that had no technology. It was like a traditional D&D town.
That's awesome.
If anyone ever asks you what is chaotic player energy, it is convincing a small civilization that you are gods.
Yeah.
If anyone ever asks you what chaotic DM energy is, it's making a small commune of bears.
Oh, he is the most chaotic DM. And we finished the campaign. My character that he gave a weapon to, so they became way too overpowered.
Oh boy.
Went to the bears in the past and gave them all his weapons and magic items so they could take over the world.
No, dude.
The unbearable leadership.
Yeah, some bear leadership.
All right, so at some point, us 4 are going to do a one-shot in a world run by bears, right? Like,
Yes.
This is now a thing?
Yes, we are.
We'll have to get Adrian in to DM Some Bears, the campaign for us.
We're all gonna be humanoids just enslaved by the bears.
Oh, God.
Trying to break out or some shit.
I can't bear it any longer!
What's a good compliment to bears? Should I play a turtle? Would that work? Like, we all gotta be like anthropomorphic animal races? Tabaxi?
Be a Tabaxi, a Kenku.
If I'll just play like a human druid who just wild shapes into a bear. Like, I am one of them.
I really want someone to play a Tabaxi and be like, I'm just a really skinny bear.
Yeah. Going back to this idea of these kind of core assumptions, I feel like these core assumptions fall into specific areas of focus that we can focus on in world building, like magic, religion, geography,
anthropomorphic bears,
economy, technology level, I guess.
Civilization.
That's going to be on my list now. Whenever I try to like create new stuff, is there a community of bears?
I feel like the answer should always be yes, but it should always be like it's either in the Feywild somewhere and always moves. There's just some way the players never actually reach the bears. They just constantly hear rumors of, wouldn't you know it, a bear walked into the tavern and was just acting like a man.
But pursuing the rumor always leads to like the main plot.
It's like the weirdest railroad, but instead of it being a railroad, there's just this deep subcontext of this heavily nuanced community of bears that are somehow like funding the Grand Emperor or something absolutely insane like that.
Bears aside, in terms of things like magic, technology, religion, economy, civilization, are there specific areas that you think are more important than others to focus on when world building?
I think as a question, it heavily relies on your players, or at the very least, the story you're trying to tell. If you're telling like a grand fantasy, we're going to save the world, politics isn't necessarily going to be the first thought on what you focus on. You're going to want that grand, overarching threat to the world. And that's always a good place to start. But if you're doing like, your players are just people, they're the more sort of anti-hero, we're just trying to make things work, we're just trying to get through it on ourselves, that's when you want to start maybe adding more depth into things like the politics of your region, because that's the sort of thing the players are more likely to interact to. If your players are looking to tell a story where they're, to that sort of cliche of like almost god figures, they're not going to be interested in petty politics. They're going to be interested in saving the world or reaching their own goals. And I think, for me personally, I need to know those character goals to decide what's important to me.
I think for me, I think religion is one of like the most important factors when building a world, because religion in itself, in a setting like D&D or whatever tabletop world you're trying to create, opens and closes so many doors just by the sheer fact of, does it exist or not? Is it there? Because if you have like all this is pantheon of gods, okay, that opens a lot of doors in the way big bads, because there's good gods, there's bad gods. Is the party going to go up against bad deities? There's going to be conflict because there's religious group A and religious group B that's going to go against each other. If there's no religion, what else is there that drives the world, and why are there conflicts, or why are there doesn't matter what it is. Religion to me is, I think, one of the, if not the most important thing to establish when creating a world. That's always how I've gone at it. I know exactly what direction and what conflicts there are in the world as soon as I found the religion. That's such a key thing in my experience and opinion.
Similarly, as I talked about, I start with religion, but it's one of those questions. I was like thinking of this right now, and I was like, it really, I think, changes based on every campaign. Generally, I would say, like, if you're like looking at a very typical D&D adventure and world, I would say I think the least important is economy. Just, every town doesn't need, I know the DM's guide is like, Waterdeep gold is worth 10 gold in Waterdeep, but 5 gold everywhere else or something. And
Yeah, fuck that.
yeah, that's too much.
Gold's gold, bro.
Economy was important in the current campaign I'm running up in the north, and based on like which towns were more prosperous, there was just this sense I went with like, oh, the markup on things because it's hard to get them is this much in each place. But I would say, yeah, least important overall, I think, is that type of like nitpicky economy. And I think my most important, apart from going religion in this big thing, is focusing on I like to focus on, like, you know, when they start, what are the 3 quests they can go on? You know, I kind of try and throw 3 things into the town. There's 3 little hooks here that the players can grab one of them and where that kind of leads. Because as much as I can focus on, you know, the world and all these things, you know, I need to focus also, part of that world is what are the cool things that the players get to do in it? And how has that, you know, that existence of the wizard tower they can go to for their first little adventure, what does that now say to the rest of everything around it?
So, from what I'm gathering from that, is it safe to say that you kind of put the minimal needed in basically every area, and then allow the players to show you the importance and then begin to flesh it out more?
Yeah, I'd say there's a good amount of that. I mean, if there's somewhere on the world map that they're really never going to get to for like multiple sessions, I can leave those small things down there. But I usually try and be like, you know, if this is the starting town, here's the 3 things nearby to focus on. And then a rough idea of where those could possibly go. Like, what will they find out at the wizard's tower that might make them want to go somewhere else? And then, you know, as I've said, my players will say they'll go somewhere and the next session go somewhere completely different. So it's why I like to have a bit for everything. And I know you've mentioned it before, having those, like, you know, a few key points in every town, like a person, what they want, what they're after, you know, something about the town that makes it special.
Yeah, in all this, I do agree that I think it does vary from campaign to campaign, but in my own personal experience, I do tend to focus on like the idea of deities and pantheon a bit more, just because, like, for a lot of the classes, and this is of course for D&D because that's the system I play in mostly, is deities are connected to many of the classes that players get to play. So making sure that any player who does decide to pursue a class that is more divine in nature, that we can figure out what their relationship is, because the relationship for that class is important. And as deities go, they're incredibly powerful figures in these fantasy worlds. So knowing their motivations and if and how they're going to get involved, understanding who these people are is kind of important, though it might also be something that you can let go for a while, because they might not get involved until a much higher level. So it might just be like knowing who they are first, letting it go so then the player knows their relationship, and then focusing on things like magic and technology. I think those are my 2 other big points. But I agree. Economy and commerce is kind of don't particularly need it. Unless you're doing like an all rogues game where they're like, we want to hunt down the biggest diamond. And it's like, well, that town has the biggest diamond. And yeah, I think there is some circumstantial situations that change this answer.
Yeah, I would say like in older D&D, when there was a kind of a focus that, you know, at some point you'd be building a stronghold and like might be building a town that your adventurers are, you know, have created and all these things. Yeah, I'd say maybe economy becomes more important, but 5e especially is like, you know, very fluffy on those type of things. There's rules for them, but they're not defined in any way other than it exists. Like, it's like you can spend 500,000 to like build a stronghold. And that's, I think, all that it mentions about that.
I think that's probably the positive part about economy as a focus. You can sort of ignore it because it's one of those things that you can balance out later on. If you suddenly decide that things are super expensive here, okay, so I'm going to give my players a higher reward. I'm going to have people offer them more gold to do the things they want them to do because the prices are more here. And people aren't going to do the work for less money. Or you go to this place, they don't really use gold that much. They don't have very much. Okay. So maybe they're not going to get as much gold as a reward, but maybe they're going to get offered items that are more valuable. because this civilization or this little settlement deals more with trade and the value of items. I feel like with economy specifically, you can very much sort of play around with it later on and maybe not wing it, but you can adjust. All the prices in the books, they're guidelines. You can do what you want.
Yeah, and it might be like if you're focusing on like a specific settlement or a town, like when I was talking religion, that's more like when you're like starting big world building focus. But if I'm focusing on a town, I might focus on the culture, like the people of that a bit more. I might put my focus as that. Just because people are the ones who make decisions and they're sentient, so they affect everything. So it's like, yeah, of course, everything's going to start at people. And once you know who the people are, they affect the other areas. So yeah, it goes back to that spider webbing idea that you were talking about at the beginning there, Ethan.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those senses of some of the focuses are much better if you start big, and some of them much better if you start small. In terms of religion, you don't need to know necessarily the structure of each individual church in each individual town. You can wing that later on, or you can decide it later on if you think the players are going to go there. But then when you get into something like local cultures, for example, that sort of thing where you start, maybe not super small down to each individual person, but where you start with like what makes these places unique culturally. That's, to me, what gives that sense of the world being alive and that variety of this isn't just generic human settlement 4.
And I think that segues nicely into the next question. How do you guys make your homebrew settings feel unique?
Stealing a lot of really good things from other places.
Intellectual theft.
Yeah.
It's better to steal a good idea than to think of a shitty one.
Oh, yeah.
I think my focus on as far as like unique selling points essentially of the world. When I started, I had none. It was very basic, and I was like, oh yeah, sure, this is very stereotypical, but we'll do it. It's fine. It'll do just fine. And over the years, as I've become more experienced and also a lot more self-aware, like, oh, why is this town just the same as a town like 5 towns back? I started, I don't know, I think subconsciously I throw a lot of like guilds and organizations in the mix. That's something that I have like a plethora of, most of which not even touched or discussed or explored by the party that is playing the campaign. But I have a lot of like organizations, and that can be from like a fighter's guild type of thing to a guild of assassins to a guild of merchants to a guild of pirates. There's groups and group set settings for there's at least like one sort of group or guild in every major town there is. That is something that I at first subconsciously started doing, and then I became self-aware. I was like, hey, wait a second. That's something I do. And I kind of kept doing it because it adds something new and different to each town in that sense, where there's always this like organized group that are up to something, and whether that something is something super mundane as fishing, or they can be hired to kill people, and anything in between. It adds something interesting to just the way people do things in that town in particular.
Yeah. How do I make my homebrew setting feel unique? And I don't think there is really a strong specific thing. I think it's near impossible that you are going to make something fully unique, because you can always trace it back to like the influences from other stories and stuff. But what makes it unique is the fact that it's like you and your players that will be interacting with it, and their inputs, and the way that you have, as I said before, kind of jokingly, but also seriously, have like stolen from things that you enjoy. Like your world will probably be influenced by the type of stories that have worlds that you like and find interesting, but you're not going to, totally take Hyrule from Legend of Zelda. You might be like, ooh, I really like this like idea that there's all these temples everywhere to, different elements. And then you're like, oh, but I really like the, political kind of divisions that exist in something like A Song of Ice and Fire. And I think it's just like, don't worry if you're like, oh no, I've taken something, this is really similar to another story. Like partway through my last campaign, we realized one of the characters unintentionally made their backstory / my influences on it Zuko's story from Avatar: The Last Airbender. And when we finished it, we're like, you're Zuko. You just beat your sister who was going to be the Fire Lord in an Agni Kai. And the players, though, they're not sitting there being like, oh no, this story wasn't like, it was from somewhere else. None of us came up with this idea. It was like, oh shit, that's awesome. It was super fun. So yeah, I think, it will be unique because of all the influences you have had inherently. But it will be unique while also not being unique. Oxymoron.
I think there's a fair point there in that maybe unique is the wrong term for this question, because you're right. I don't think it's very hard these days now to have an entirely original idea, especially with fantasy genres and sci-fi genres having been written so much about in the last century. So maybe, and Dutch, if you want to re-answer this question as well, how do you make your homebrew setting feel interesting, perhaps, is the right question.
Conflict. It's just like, have big conflicts in the world that your players can get involved with and be influential in. Start your setting, history. Peace is a very weird thing in history if you look at it. There are few times where the world is at peace. Even now, if you're thinking like, oh, it's a peaceful setting. It's not like that everywhere. And especially if you're looking at like medieval times and things that are closer to the quote unquote time period that D&D kind of sits around typically. It's like, oh, I think the thing that will instantly grab your players into a world is like, there's something under the surface there. They don't need to be involved right away, but it's like, ooh, something's a stirring, and they know that they're going to get to be involved with it. And from your end, I think, if you make a world where there is that conflict there, like something is stirring under the surface, you'll also have a lot of fun writing that world. Because that instantly gives you something to flesh out, things to scheme behind the scenes. And scheming's fun.
Absolutely. And even with talk of conflict and peace, there can be that public view of peace, but there's always going to be nations with differing interests that behind the scenes there is that conflict. Whether it's something as small as emissaries and spies being sent into other capitals to keep an eye on what they're doing, or whether it's as large as a war, there is never that true sense of peace, in my opinion, in the sort of settings that we build for. There might be some tabletop games that maybe facilitate for that, but for D&D specifically, there needs to be some level of conflict, whether that's people v people, or people v eldritch horrors, or angels and demons. There's always some form of conflict, and when you expand into multiple continents, multiple planes, there's always someone somewhere is doing something that someone else doesn't like.
Yeah, I mean, the conflict is great. It's such a good source for quests or just random interactions with NPCs in town. It's always a topic that locals of the area will be very aware of and can inform the party of, and there's always people that are looking to hire people to be on their side in a conflict or do something to mess with the other side in a conflict. Conflict is a really good source for a lot of key things when it comes to building a world, or not necessarily building a world, but giving your players stuff to do. Conflicts are a very rich source of things for players to experience and do in a campaign, or even in a one shot. Doesn't even matter in a tabletop game.
Yeah, I mean, conflict is why stories happen, right? And in terms of how making a setting feel unique, I like to throw in like a Seven Wonders of the World kind of thing. If you're not fleshing out the entire world at once, maybe it's only taking place in a specific region or on a specific continent. I'll be like, there is this one place you just gotta see at some point, whether that's man-made or if it is a natural wonder. I like to throw something maybe not always big, but that's an easy way to go about it, the big tree or the giant waterfall. But because we've also got magic in a D&D setting, there's a lot you can do. Like in the One Piece anime, there's this like mountain where the water runs upward, and it's like, that's weird.
I think that sort of ties into something you spoke about earlier, where you spoke about those one sentence descriptors of places, and we spoke about trying to make different areas feel unique. I think, for me personally, if you're playing D&D in a fantasy setting, especially a high magic setting, go with it, run with it, do the wildest, weirdest shit you can think of. Because your players will look at that and they'll be like, fuck, that's cool. But on top of that, it builds in that sense of we're not in Kansas anymore. You know, you want to give your players that, almost you want to challenge their beliefs on what the world setting is, because you want them to look at that and be like, that's far beyond what we could do with our magics. There's power there. My capital city in one of the worlds that I ran and one of the campaigns that I ran had a massive stone pillar that floated in the middle of the city, inscribed with glowing celestial runes that were so old that our players that spoke Celestial struggled to make it out, as if you were reading like a book that was in English but written 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And that, to them, they never really got into depth with what meaning that was. And as a DM, I knew that there was meaning, there was story behind it. But to them, it was just, that's really weird and really cool, and that makes this place stand out to us. I think if you're going to go for that high fantasy setting, run with it. And those sort of wild and weird ideas that you can pinch and just throw in are, again, what makes your world field interesting and unique. I think you want to take those ideas that you have that you're passionate about, those things that you're passionate about, and you want to build them into the world if you can. Players are never going to be playing a world and going, this is the exact same as such and such, and therefore it's not boring. Because they've got their own stories that they want to tell within it. And if you're facilitating that, they're probably going to enjoy the world. But by adding in those things that you're passionate about, maybe, for example, one of my Dutch friends is a geologist. And I was like, you know what, I would love to run a D&D like short campaign or a one-shot where we can throw in that sort of geology aspect. You know, maybe precious metals were super rare in this world. So instead of forming precious metals as a currency became based in gemstones, or stone specifically. So all the coins are made out of stone and carved out of specific stones. Or for me, in my world, it's food. I grew up as a kid. My mum's a chef. So I grew up as a kid cooking. I grew up around food. I'm not a skinny guy. I love cooking. So I inject that into all of my world building. I'll be building something and I'll say, okay, what sort of spices would be most common here? What sort of culturally different foods would there be? Some of my players have genuinely been like, you need to come over and cook this because that sounds great. And I think that's it very much like when you go, we were talking about making things unique. If you go to every tavern serves the same thing for breakfast. Your players are going to stop asking what's for breakfast. They're just going to go, we have breakfast and we leave to go do what we're doing. And I'll be like, okay, so I'm going to build one example that I really enjoy, and it's probably my favorite example. They're in a tavern in one of the scummier districts in the main capital city. And I decided early on that this wasn't necessarily a slums, but it was outside the city walls, this district. It was, an overspill of people that had fled to the city to escape conflict. And there was a significant halfling population here. So the city would feed these people, but you wouldn't be getting top quality food. For example, the bread you would get would be castaways, leftovers from the upper echelons. So what would historically people do with stale bread? They would try and bake it again, or fry it, or do something with it in the same way that, like, if you have meat that's historically in places where there was significant issues preserving meat because of food, heat or temperature or moisture, and maybe it wasn't at its greatest, you'd be like, okay, throw a bunch of spices on it, cook it, no one will be able to tell that it was a bit ropey. So for me, what I did to design this breakfast was, okay, I'm going to take the idea of stale bread. What would I do if I had stale bread at home and nothing else to eat? Grab whichever spice is most abundant, something sweet, pan fry it, throw that on top. And we ended up with what we called cinnamon toast or cinnamon bread, which was literally like fried bread with sugar and cinnamon. And it became sort of like a halfling cultural breakfast, because when they moved as refugees to this city and they had this stale bread, that was the most common spice they brought with them. That was the sort of thing they would do with that food. But all of a sudden, it's not just a tavern breakfast. It's, okay, these people have a diverse culture. They have different foods. They eat different things than what you would expect to find in a tavern, maybe in an upper district. And playing around with that sense of food specifically for me is what I like to do in my worlds. But obviously it doesn't have to be food. You take whatever you're passionate about and build it. If you're passionate about clothing, okay, what differences in fashion are there between these cultures? Is that based in pure aesthetics? Is that based in functionality? Is that based within the culture of the place? If you're passionate about technology, okay, how would there be differences in designs of day-to-day tools? That sort of where you bring your own personal interests in and you build that into your world is what I think makes each DM unique.
Yeah, that was really well put. Definitely, like, whatever you as an individual are like interested in or specialize in, definitely bring that into your game. Like, that is an amazing way to make your setting feel like your players aren't going to experience this world by any other dungeon master. That's superb.
And there's something about playing D&D, right? And I'm not a skinny guy either, right? And then this guy starts describing all these wild fucking dishes of food. I'm just sitting there like, okay, dude, nice. Yeah, I'm hungry, cool. Now that's all I'm gonna think of for the next like 5 hours of my day. Sick, dude. Thanks.
All right, to the point where we're running a charity thing at the moment. But one of the things that's been discussed is, okay, Ethan needs to do a D&D themed cooking stream where he cooks things that he's spoken about in D&D. I'd like to bring that food and drink in. I've spoken a little with Dutch about my Campaign 2 character, but my Campaign 2 character has a history of bartender, so I haven't just gone, he's a bartender. I've gone, okay, I'm going to take the 100 most popular cocktails, and I'm going to think, how can I make those embedded in fantasy? How can I turn something like a coffee liqueur? How would they make that in a fantasy world?
I mean, you know that I'm just going to, whenever I need ideas for a tavern, I'm going to hit you up and listen, you're bartender man, help me out. You got this list of 100 D&D inspired cocktails. Just give me a few and I'll put them on the menu.
I absolutely do. Like, I got deep into it to the point of like, okay, well, if you go and get like a dwarven vodka, it's actually closer to some sort of whiskey that they've made out of like root vegetables, and that sort of it's over the top, sure, but taking those things that interest you.
D&D is over the top. Like,
of course, it's over the top.
High fantasy is over the top, which is one of the things I like the most about it, is because there's nothing you can't do. If you want to have an entire session based on a bunch of people just drinking the weirdest cocktails or having the most insane like concepts of food, like, bro, go for it, because why not? You know, like, there's nothing stopping you.
I feel like it's something that 5th edition or D&D in general gets a lot of bad rep for, where people say, oh, it's a high fantasy setting. Okay, but there are hundreds of thousands of tabletop settings. If you're going to play D&D, sure, you can modify it for other things, but if you're going to throw in that high fantasy, why not just bite the bullet and go all in with it, rather than dip your toe in and go, oh, I don't know, that fantasy maybe feels a bit too off for me. Just go for it and commit to it and, you know, play within the bounds of what it was built for, that high fantasy setting. You can be over the top and no one's going to turn around and be like, actually, that's far too over the top. That isn't a spell in the player's handbook, and therefore that mage wouldn't have cast that. No.
Because nobody cares.
Nobody cares. You're not playing. If you're playing tabletop games for other genres, absolutely. If you're playing tabletop games for like a really gritty experience, absolutely. But if you're playing D&D specifically and you go into it knowing that the world is high fantasy, then just commit to it, and your players aren't going to challenge you on that. They're not. I mean, hopefully, there's always going to be that one. But at the end of the day, like, magic surpasses what the players have access to. It's high fantasy. Do what you want to do. figure out the justifications afterwards.
Yeah, it really is just limited to what your imagination is capable of at that point. Well, does anybody have anything else they'd like to add on in terms of notes on world building?
Naming things. How you name anything Elven? Grab as many letters as you can and try and pronounce it as if it was written in Old French. That's it. That's your Elvish name.
Chuck at least 2 apostrophes in there somewhere.
Exactly.
To go.
Lemon a wemenamel.
Exactly.
Beautiful. Great.
How did you know that's the name of the Elven Prince in my current campaign?
if you can't sing it, it's not proper Elvish. And obviously, like, everyone will differ on this, but again, it's one of those things. I like to have naming conventions because I'm dumb. And those naming conventions involve how a language sounds more than how a language is grammatically.
True, yeah. Language is such a huge part of making things feel interesting. Like if it's a Dwarven culture, it's like, oh God, how does Dwarven culture go? It's like, I mean, your rules can change based on your setting, but I automatically go to probably a lot of consonants, a bit more of a hard sound, maybe, and compare it to like a real word language, maybe kind of German-like or Gaelic.
I do a lot of like dwarves with the whole like their last name is their profession. So it's like, oh, this is like Sven Ironbreaker. Why? Well, because he's a blacksmith. He, breaks the iron and reshapes it.
Yeah, that's what I do as well with my dwarves.
I feel like if you're going to play into that traditional, maybe not a stereotype, but concept of dwarves, of being very utilitarian, that language fits in with that. It's that whole, why use many words when few words do trick? Dwarvish language for me is always about conveying what you want as easily as possible because you've got other stuff to do. If you're in the mine for 12 hours, you don't want to come up and have a long 4-day conversation about the fact that you had some toast for lunch. Whereas, obviously, Elvish language, and I think this is a lot of fantasy writings play into this trope, but elves live for an incredibly long time, and therefore there's going to be less of that emphasis on
urgency.
There's going to be less of that
non-native speaker voice, by the way.
Oh, shut up. Ik bedoel Nederlanders.
Okay, relax, dude.
I learned some Dutch just to annoy my DM. If you're talking about how elves would speak, for example, and obviously they're a lot older, they're going to have less of an urgency in the way they speak because they have more time. And it's sure, it seems a little bit silly of a concept, but when you think about it, the more you talk about it, the more it makes sense. And it fits us definitely with the aesthetic that I write elves to, with that very sort of graceful, beautiful, calm demeanor. The language fits that. The language is over the top, almost Shakespearean. Why tell someone she looks nice when you can say that her beauty radiates from her to the point of brightening the flowers throughout the meadow? That sort of over-the-top nature that is absolutely stupid, but that's why Elvish conversations take so long. Why use 3 words when you can use 30? And even down to, human culture, are there going to be not just changes in accent necessarily, but also changes in terminology in your world building of language? If you have someone that comes from the other side of the world, are they going to know things by different names, and is there going to be different slang they use? Look at the UK for an example, where you travel, I think it's something like the average distance you travel is something like 40 miles, and then you've got an entirely different dialect, because there's so many rural communities that were formed on their own and developed their own language constructs and rules, that you get those differences in accents. I'm talking in what I would consider to be a reasonably proper English voice, which tends to be my voice when I talk about things like this, and then someone will say something that gets me angry and I'll come out in a proper right Yorkshire accent and we're off down to shops and it'll be fine. But someone who's never spoke to anyone from Yorkshire before is going to be like, what was that? What is he saying? What does he mean?
Hey, you just made sounds at me right now and it all went over my head.
Hey, bye, John, love. Out for now, off down to shops.
I was like, are you having a stroke?
Oh my.
Go to the shop.
Going to the shops.
But yeah, and then you could have like common phrases and idioms. Like back where I'm from, we say, well, if you can't grab a dog by its tail, then it's not worth trying. I don't know, something stupid like that.
100%. There are always going to be phrases like one of the great Yorkshire ones is now wetter than water, which is, there's nothing wetter than water, which, okay, but what does that mean in the context of that sentence? What? You're having a conversation with someone, they're like, well, there's nothing wetter than water.
True.
But those sort of, like, even as a player, if you're making a character that's from somewhere else, like, picking, like, one or two things they say that everyone else is going to turn around and be like, wait, what? Gives your character that sense of that far traveler sort of feel. That sense of...
They've got their own culture.
Exactly. Oh, we're all big D&D nerds, huh?
Yeah.
No.
What? What's a D&D?
What's a D&D? Wow. Yeah, this just goes to show, like, it really does pay to have, like, knowledge in many different areas. Like, I'm sure a lot of DMs become kind of trivia masters.
Ask your friends. If you don't know something, you probably know someone who does.
It's that thing of at some point a player's going to ask you how much a goose weighs, and you now know for the rest of your life how much a goose weighs. Because they tried to fit 32 of them in a bag of holding with a jar of mayonnaise.
It's silly but true.
I saw a meme this morning of somebody asking, like, D&D is the only time where you will look up how much mayonnaise you could possibly eat before you die, just because you gave an alchemy jar to one of your players.
Absolutely. But now that information will live with you forever in the deep recesses of your brain. You're going to be on your deathbed, you're going to be surrounded by grandchildren. Look to you, grandfather, what is your eternal knowledge? You can eat 12 jars of Hellmann's before you croak.
Now I'm like, how much mayonnaise can you eat?
I think the favorite one that I had to do was I was DMing something, and someone asked me that if you cast Speak with Animals, would a sheep have an accent depending where it's from? And I was like, I have no idea. But I found out that cows have regional accents. Cows moo differently based on where they're from. So I was like, sure, other livestock will. And now it's forever in my brain that cows moo differently depending on where they're from.
That's
Yep,
real?
absolutely.
What?
That is so cool.
That's wild. What the fuck?
Well, speaking of trivia folk, how does everybody feel about jumping into a game?
Oh, this is where I'm gonna expose myself as knowing nothing about D&D, bro. Here we go. Let's go.
Did I study? Nope.
To be fair, every other time we've played this game, everybody's been like, I should be fine, I'm a DM, and then everyone's failed. I think I've made today a little bit easier, but we'll see how it goes.
So if we win, it's not a real win, is what we're learning.
That's right. It's a watered down win.
Yeah.
No, I think it'll still be a challenge, but easier than I think I've done. Anyway, so the game today that I'm pitching towards my players is the one where we reveal their true knowledge of spells within D&D, at least specifically within the player's handbook. Today's game is called Spell Check. So, in terms of the rules for the game, I really should have had these up here. Look at me thinking ahead. It's if you guys are familiar with the TV show game Jeopardy, it's like that. If not, there's going to be. I've kind of condensed it. There's 3 categories. Today, those categories are going to be spell class lists. So we've got cleric, druid, and wizard. Underneath each of these, there's going to be a first level spell slot question, second level spell slot question, and a third one. We'll determine randomly who goes first. They get to choose one of these prompts. I'll read to you a clue, and then you guys will buzz in, and whoever buzzes in first, you get the chance to answer first. You'll have 30 seconds, so feel free to take your 30 seconds to think about your answer. If you get it wrong, you lose the value of the spell slot of that question, and somebody else has a chance to steal. If you get it right, you of course get the value of the spell slot. We keep going until all 9 of these questions are gone. Hidden amongst them is the font of magic, which I'll explain when that comes up. And once they're all gone, we move on to the final cast, which I will show you guys the category of the question. Based on your confidence, you can wager an amount of your spell slots you've earned. And then I will give you the question with a multiple choice. You write down your answer, and we see if you double or lose. How you feeling?
Terrified.
It's the worst that can happen. I'll just play martial classes for the rest of my life.
True.
It is a lot of rules, but hopefully you guys will get the hang of it.
Is Jeopardy the show where you like have to answer in a question? So like, what is insert answer here? Right?
That is how they do it, but nobody's been doing it.
It's the one where it's like, I'll take America for 500, Jeff.
Yeah.
But it's going to be, I'll take Cleric for 3 spell slots.
Mainland Europe, so we don't get no Jeopardy and shit.
Technically, yeah. In Jeopardy, you answer with a question. I don't think we're going, what is a fireball?
No. I was just like making sure that I knew what the hell you were talking about. Because, like I said, we don't get many of those game shows around here.
All right, so we're ready to go. Again, for the listeners at home, I've got a like full-on Jeopardy board for these guys so they can actually see what's going on here. And we've rolled for initiative, and Logan's going to be the one choosing the first prompt. Again, the 3 categories are Cleric, Druid, and Wizard. So, Logan, what would you like to choose?
No, let's just risk it for the biscuit. Give me Wizard for 3 spell slots.
Wizard for 3. All right, here it is. When I grow up, I want to be just like you. And with this 8th level spell, I can, and I will. Dutch has buzzed in first.
Polymorph?
Unfortunately not. So that's going to be 3-point spell slot loss. Oh, there we go. I only have to press that once. All right, so Dutch is -3 in the hole, and Logan got the buzz in on that one. Logan, what is your guess?
What is clone?
That is correct.
I should have known that, bro.
You should have known that. We're currently dealing with a big bad that has clones. I just didn't buzz in time.
Unfortunate. Because Logan got that one correct. So Logan, you can choose once again. I'm going to clear the buzzer whenever you're ready.
All right, let's go. Let's go down that list. Give me Wizard for 2.
Wizard for 2. Okay. The name of this 5th level spell could be used to describe ice cream, or you could just freeze your enemies with it. All right, Dutch has buzzed in. The counter is starting.
I'm not sure, because I'm thinking this might be a 4th level spell. Is it Cone of Cold?
Cone of Cold is correct.
Boom, baby.
Up 2 points, back to -1. All right. Since you got that one correct, you get to choose the next one.
Let's go, let's go easy. Let's go Druid for 1.
Druid for 1, all right. There is that saying of beans, the magical fruit, but beans have nothing on this 1st level spell. Beanie, you're in first.
Is it Goodberry?
That is correct. It is Goodberry.
Oh, yeah.
Guys, this is probably the first time it hasn't been like one-sided or just a complete desolation of everybody, so I'm very excited. All right, Beanie, you have gotten that one correct. Which category and spell slot would you like to choose?
I'm going to play to my strengths. I'm going to go Cleric for 3, please.
Cleric for 3 spell slots. All right, what we've got. A cleric could use 5,000 gold pieces to build a structure preventing people from coming onto their property, or they could use it to buy a diamond in order to cast this 9th level spell. All right, Dutch has buzzed in.
True Resurrection?
Unfortunately, True Resurrection is not the answer we're looking for.
Boy.
Logan has buzzed in.
Oh, I'm probably going to mess this up, but is it Forbiddance?
Unfortunately, it's not Forbiddance. Okay, I might have spoken too soon about all this. All right, and Beanie, by default, would you like to answer this question, or would you like to let it pass?
If it's not True Resurrection, the only 9th level spell I can think of that has a material component is Gate.
Final answer?
Yeah, why not?
That is the answer we were looking for. It is Gate.
Good job.
Imagine paying 5,000 gold for something you can just put on the front of your fence.
That's. I mean, I thought that clue was very, very clever.
Oh man, I just realized.
Yeah, like the clue didn't twig. The clue didn't twig until I was thinking about it, and I was like, coming onto your property.
Yeah, that's why. Give yourself the full 30 seconds to think about it and like look at the clue. Absolutely. All right. So, Beanie, you've got the next choice.
I will take Cleric for 2, please.
Cleric for 2. An escape artist might appreciate having the effects of this buffing 4th level spell on them. Their job would become much easier, and those handcuffs wouldn't stand a chance. Beanie's got it.
Is it Expeditious Retreat?
Unfortunately not. I'm going to put that timer on, and if nobody buzzes in, the question will pass. Dutch has buzzed in.
Is it a 4th level spell? I don't know. No, I fucked up. I messed up. Knock.
Unfortunately, not is not what we're looking for. Right, Logan, I'm going to give you 10 seconds to decide if you want to buzz in or not.
Okay.
Do it. Do it.
Buffing
Do it.
spell. I don't know.
You buzzed in.
Yeah. Okay, so handcuffs wouldn't stand a chance. It's a buffing spell. Oh, why the fuck did I buzz in?
The worst part is I think I know it, and I'm so mad at myself.
Oh no, greater invisibility?
Unfortunately, that is not the answer we are looking for. The answer we were looking for is freedom of movement.
Because you can't be paralyzed or restrained.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and you can use, I think it's 5 feet of your movement to escape any restraints.
I was thinking of freedom of movement. Wrong name, Expeditious Retreat.
Unfortunate. Nobody got that one correct, so you get to choose again.
Cleric for 1.
Cleric
I'll
for
play
1.
it safe.
A second level spell requiring no concentration and makes a cleric feel like the Green Lantern, able to summon things like a sword or a frying pan. Take that, conjuration wizard. Logan got it first.
Spiritual weapon.
That is correct. That is a spell slot for Logan. Okay, Logan, we've got 3 categories left. We've got wizard for 1 spell slot and the 2nd and 3rd levels of druid.
Give me wizard for 1.
Wizard for 1, okay. A cantrip that almost every modern cell phone has the ability to cast, but if you kept it on for 1 hour, that wouldn't be very bright of you, as your cell phone might die. Logan again.
Light?
That is the answer we were looking for, light. Bringing Logan to a net 0, Beanie in the lead with 2, and Dutch a bit in the hole, but we can...
Hey, we don't have to talk about that.
Not drawing attention to that.
Because you said cell phone, I literally almost just yelled message, and I was like, wait, no.
Exactly the same, and then I was like, no, it's light, and then I went, you beat me to the button.
That is exactly what I was thinking when I made that clue. I was like, they're going to think message right off the hop. All right, Logan, what are you choosing?
Well, I know shit all about druid, so let's go druid for 2.
You have found the font of magic.
Oh boy.
All right. So, Logan, before I reveal the question to you, you can wager an amount of your spell slots up to the maximum. However, you're at 0. So, how this game will treat a situation where somebody's in the negative or at 0 is you're loaned 3 spell slots to use in these situations. So, out of the 3, how much would you like to wager? Because if you get this wrong, you will lose that wager.
Yo, let's just go all 3. Risk it for the biscuit.
Oh, no.
All right. And because this is a font of magic, Logan is the only one that has the opportunity to answer this question. So let's move over to the font. This 5th level spell would be a great way to ensure social distancing, unless the things getting close to you are undead or constructs.
I assume it's a cleric spell. Boy, do I not.
So it's actually a druid spell because you picked the druid category.
Oh boy, as I said, I knew nothing about druids. Unless they're constructs or undead.
10 seconds.
I don't know, is it forbiddance this time? I'm pretty sure that's a spell that stops things from doing things.
Unfortunately, that is not the answer we were looking for. It is anti-life shell, which actually is a spell that clerics also get. Logan's unfortunately lost those 3 points, and I gotta get rid of that. Oh, the management. All right. There is only 1 question left, so we'll just get right into it. For Druid for 3rd level spell slot, this 7th level spell would confuse the heck out of Sir Isaac Newton. Well, for 1 minute at least. Logan.
Reverse gravity.
That is the answer we were looking for. Giving you the 3 points you just lost. All the questions are clear. Beanie in the lead, Logan at 0, and apparently we're not going to talk about Dutch. We're happy you're here, though. You still get to participate in the final question.
Nice.
And again, because you and Logan are both at either 0 or negative, I'm going to loan you 3 spell slots to use in this wager. So, the category for the final cast is spells from magic items. This is going to be multiple choice. There will be 5 possible answers. Based on the prompt, wager an amount of your spell slots from none to all in. In the case of Logan and Dutch, you can wager up to 3. Write your wager on a piece of paper that you guys have gotten before we started. I'm going to reveal the question to you and the possible answers. After I reveal them, write your answer on that same piece of paper. Once everyone's ready, you're going to show your piece of paper to the webcam, and I'm going to reveal to everyone what you've wagered and what answer you've given. All right. Does everybody have their wager written?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
All right. So let's go on over to the question. The Staff of Power is a very rare item which you can break over your knee, causing an explosion of force and possibly teleporting you to another plane of existence and out of the explosion. But if you don't break it, the Staff of Power also lets you cast some spells using some of the item's 20 charges. The spells I'm about to list are all spells that it can cast, but which of them uses the most of its charges in a single casting? A. Cone of Cold. B. Globe of Invulnerability. C. Hold Monster. D. A 5th level Lightning Bolt. Or E. Wall of Force. Go ahead and take the time now to consider your options and write down your letter next to your wager.
I looked out on this. I played Wizard because the character, the player wasn't there on Sunday, so I played the Wizard.
Who has the Staff of Power?
Oh,
Yeah.
man. So they've all got their wagers and their letters ready. So, everybody hold your answers up to the cam. All right, so Beanie has wagered 2 spell slots for B, Dutch has wagered 3 spell slots for E, and Logan has wagered 3 spell slots for B. Beanie and Logan, you've gotten yours correct, so Beanie's score goes up to 4. Logan's goes up to 3. Beanie takes the game by 1 point. The answer was Globe of Invulnerability.
It's
Good
6
job.
charges, right? It's only 1 more
That's
than
exactly
most
right.
of them on here.
Everything else that was listed is 5.
That's cheeky. Oh,
Congratulations,
Good job.
Beanie.
that was
You have
rough.
taken the game.
Man, I suck, dude. Holy shit.
Well, thank you very much. If anyone would like to sponsor me to play on their version of D&D Jeopardy, I'm happy to take a sponsorship. Dutch was here for emotional support. Thank you to my fans, my family.
Okay, bro, don't push it, dude. Relax.
Oh, dear.
And if any of you contact me to play on D&D Jeopardy, I will throw this book at you that I wrote my answer in. This just made me realize how little I know.
Dude,
honestly-
I said this beforehand. I suck at spells in particular. Are definitely my weak points when it comes to like knowledge of things.
Realistically, I only got about 3 questions right. I was just smart enough to let everyone else make mistakes.
Yeah, I shouldn't have guessed on the last one that was just thrown on to me because no one else got it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is that. I don't think anybody in any of the games of spell check yet have opted to do that. They're always like, no, I gotta guess.
Yeah, where's the fun in passing, dude?
Oh yeah, this was super fun.
It does make it very interesting. Thank you guys for playing that. That was awesome.
Thanks for humiliating me.
It's fine. Dutch,
Yeah.
we won't tell anyone else. You can just keep reading spells off the monster sheets and you'll be fine.
Nobody will know, right? Listeners at home? The way I see it is, we all learned about some spells today, right?
True.
I never knew there was a spell called Anti-Life Shell.
It's a brilliant spell. Honestly, that prompt at first I was like, it's got to be Spiritual Guardians, right? And I was like, wait, no, that's worse for undead. I'm stupid.
That's where my mind went. It was like, yeah, I know a lot of spells that are like shitty for undead, but not something that doesn't work on undead particularly.
I think the undead gave it away to me.
Yeah. And that's kind of why I made it the font of magic too. I was like, if somebody knows this, they'll know it. If they don't know it, it'll at least be a challenge. But now that we've got the game out of the way, this brings us on to the final section of the podcast. This is Question Dicely, our chance to hear from the listeners. So today's question comes in from Sheldon Caldwell and the Cadets, and you can follow him as @shellfish16 on Instagram. At this point, I think he's kind of like our question master. And his question is, as a dungeon master, if a player doesn't take notes and they forget something from 2 months ago, do you give them a hint? Do you give them the information outright? Or do they just need to find it on their own?
Do we all have differing opinions on this and therefore it's going to be good to go one by one, or are we the same on this? Because for me personally, I would say if their character knows it, they get the information. Because we're all busy people. We have busy lives. We're forgetful.
I differ a little bit. I make them roll a history check, and I give them information based on how high they rolled. So that's basically how I do it.
I base it a little on their character. If the character with, 6 intelligence was told something, and then that player also doesn't remember it, I'm like, your character doesn't remember it probably, but maybe maybe you can make an intelligence check to try and figure something out, or like at least remember where you might have heard it to try and recall that. If it's like the wizard with a 20 and they just like didn't write it in the notes and it's 2 months later, I might be a bit more just like, yeah, your character's smart. They probably remember this.
I think we've made some assumptions about this question too, because it says from 2 months ago. Is that 2 months in game or 2 months in real life? If it's real life, I'll just be like, no sweat. If it's recent information, I'll give it to you. If it's 2 months in game and the player doesn't remember it and they didn't take notes, I'd be like, all right, what's your intelligence look like? Maybe I'll give it to you. Your intelligence isn't great. I'm going to make you roll for it. Maybe I'm merciful. Maybe I'll just give it to you. I don't care. Is it plot critical? I'll probably just give it to you.
I like your answer better and now want to change mine to that.
I guess it really depends on the context of what they're asking. Because obviously it comes down to, is it a question from the player or the character for me? If the character's asking something, like the character was told something in world and they've forgotten that, I might be more likely to go for a check. For me, if it's something that like the players should know and maybe you've forgotten because it's been a long time since you were here, if they say, oh, isn't this the place we met such and such? Oh, or what's the name of the guy that we met here when we were here last? I think I'm more likely to give that because I can relate to that a lot. I work full time. I care for a family member. I do online stuff as well. So sometimes when we get to Sundays, I message Dutch before and I'm like, man, I promise you I'm going to enjoy this session, but I'm going to ask you the same question in combat 4 times because I am not with it.
You do that not just in combat. You'll like talk to me about something in DMs, and then 2 days later, then no DMs in between, ask me that same question again. And I'm like, bro, read up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I, as a DM, relate a lot and can understand a lot the concept of my character's smart, or my character remembers things, or even just, it's important. My character would have remembered, but I as a player, I'm stupid.
Yeah, like context definitely matters, but in general, like you said, like if it's very plot heavy or like integral to the plots, like, sure, I'll give it to you. But 9 out of 10 times, if it's not super important, I'll just be like, just make a history check, and based on that, I'll like. It's not that I'll always like give them something unless they roll really poorly, but based on how high they roll is how much they're getting out of me, which typically will also kind of proc their memory anyway, and they'll fill in the blanks themselves as well.
Yeah, it's kind of just like giving them a hint check, be like, kind of nudge, nudge. Or they ask the party who's wizard, and they're like, yeah, I know.
I guess it depends on who's asking as well. Like, there's always going to be, in every group, there is always someone that has absolutely no memory of what happened last week. And there's always that one person that has 4 PDF pages and 3 binders full of notes and turns around and goes, that one shopkeeper's the big bad. They had pink painted fingernails. The big bad had pink painted fingernails. Therefore, that person we saw outside of the game 3.5 years ago is the big bad. And you're like, well, they weren't, but now they are.
Oh, you solved it.
Just scribbles notes furiously. They are now.
Yeah, I think these are all reasonable answers, and I think it'll vary based on the context. Absolutely. So thank you, Sheldon and the cadets, for submitting that question. And for anybody else out there, if you want to submit a question to Question Dicely, send an email with your question to dicelychannel@gmail.com. And don't forget to leave a social media handle for me to give you a shout out. And with that, we're coming towards the end of the show. So I'd quickly like to thank my guests for coming in here and give you the opportunity to promote your social media and any projects you're working on. We'll start with Dutch, perhaps.
Hello. Yeah, find me on twitch.tv/ThatDutchGeek, where I stream 5 days a week, a variety of different types of content. Follow twitch.tv/DungeonSelect, because that's going to be the home of our D&D campaign as soon as this one ends. Every Sunday, 8 p.m. CET, 2 p.m. Eastern. So for D&D stuff, follow Dungeon Select on Twitch. That's really all I have to plug, really. Just my Twitch and the Dungeon Select Twitch is really all I care about.
Fair enough. How about you, Beanie?
You can find me on Twitch or Twitter or most social medias, SellotapeBeanie. I stream a variety of games, mostly at the moment FPS games. I like to dip a lot into indie. I occasionally stream some world building things with D&D. At some point, Dutch and I are going to be playing some more Baldur's Gate 3, which should be fun. If you want to get to know me outside of video gaming, I'm trying to make some really cool t-shirts. If you search retrogamerclub.company.site, I make some cool retro game and D&D themed shirts and hoodies.
You can follow me and find me on Twitter and Instagram at LCKraken. I also am on Twitch, where I stream Mondays doing miniature painting, and then the rest of the week typically playing story-based video games. And surprisingly, I think when this episode comes out, a week later, I will actually be starting a series on YouTube that is specifically focused on helping you figure out how to start world building.
Oh,
there you go.
Perfect timing then.
So, yeah, if you follow LCKraken on YouTube, hopefully by the time you're watching this a week later or so, there'll be a lovely video there.
Well, there you have it. And for the listeners at home, if for all the links that they're mentioning here, they'll be in the description of the video if you're watching this on YouTube, or in the description section of wherever you're listening to this podcast. And once again, I'd like to thank all three of my guests here, ThatDutchGeek, SellotapeBeanie, and LCKraken, for joining me on this episode about world building.
It was a pleasure. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us and our chaotic energy.
It's all good. It was very enjoyable. And for everyone else, thank you for tuning in to Speak Dicely. My name is Teni Brant, and I will speak Dicely with you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
You can find the Speak Dicely podcast on Podbean and most anywhere that you listen to podcasts. Follow Dicely DnD on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and be sure to subscribe to the Dicely DnD YouTube channel, where you can find our video series on how to play Dungeons & Dragons, as well as other videos. The Speak Dicely podcast is produced and edited by myself, Teni Brant, and the intro and outro music were created by Teni Brant. I thank you for the support, and we'll see you next time on the Speak Dicely podcast.